Hi, you guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new, then welcome. Today, I'm going to try something very different, which is I'm going to try to dupe a palette that is launching soon. It's the Kaleidos Flower Punk palette, and I just want to talk myself out of buying it, frankly speaking. So, I pulled out a bunch of my existing colorful eyeshadow palettes and I decided to find dupes or at least something similar so that I don't have to rush and pick this palette up right away. So this is no shade to the brand as such. I really love Kaleidos eyeshadow palettes. I already own a few of their palettes, which is basically one of the reasons why I don't want to rush out and pick this one up. And I decided to shop my stash, that is, look through my collection of eyeshadows and see if I could dupe them. So I found these swatches on the Trend Mode Instagram. I'll leave a link to it. If Kaleidos has already uploaded swatches, I'll leave a link to that as well. So the first shade is this pretty olivey green shade, and I found four in my collection at first. Like when I first looked through all the palettes that I had pulled out, I found four of these shades. The first one is from the Color Drain eyeshadow palette. It's the shade called Congo Basin. Then I found this olive green in the ColourPop the Child palette. It's called Float Your Crib, and it's a little darker. Then I picked up this shade Saw Diesel from the Melt Smoke Sessions palette, and lastly I found the shade Leo in the Melt Gemini palette. And then in the Gemini palette I found another shade called Fire OG, which turned out to be the closest of all the shades. So I ended up adding that as well to my arm, and I think that's the closest to this. So the next shade is this greenish gold color, and I would say my favorite green gold is the Super Shock from ColourPop in the shade Telepathy, but I don't think it's sold anymore, so I didn't include that in this. So for this I picked four shades. The first is from the Ace Beauty Oceanic palette. It's the shade Jellyfish. It leans more towards green and less gold. And the next shade is Nubia from the Juvia's Place Magic palette, and this leans more gold but does have a very slight green tint. After that I jumped into the Sydney Grace X Mel Thompson palette and picked the shade BB, and finally I swatched the shade Saturnella from the Kaleidos Escape Pod palette. Now according to me, when you layer the last shade, that is the shade from Kaleidos, with the shade from the Sydney Grace Mel Thompson palette, it gives the exact sheen that has been captured in the swatch picture. So I guess layering these shades would be the best option. Now the next shade is this mustard color, for which I swatched the shade Lorelei from the Melt Gemini palette, and it's not a spot on dupe, but it's pretty close, and I think when you blend it into your eye it'll look similar. The next shade is kind of a chartreuse like shade. So for that I picked three shades which are around that color. The first one is from the Oceanic palette. It's the shade Algae. It is more of a neon color, like this one is a lot brighter. Then I jumped into the Juvia's Place Stripe palette and picked the shade Masai. This is a lot more pastely. And the third shade is from the Kaleidos Club Nebula palette. It's the mint color from that palette, which also looks very similar to the chartreuse shade in this palette. And the next is this very beautiful pink shade, for which I found a pretty close dupe, and this is from the Juvia's Place Wala 2 palette, and it's the shade Yab. I cannot pronounce the name that correctly, but I think this is pretty spot on. The next shade is another matte shade, is a matte with mauvey or berry undertones. So I picked two shades for this. The first one is from again the Sydney Grace and Mel Thompson palette. It's the shade Bugaboo. I think that this is very close to the Flower Punk palette shade. The second option is from the Huda Beauty Mauves palette, and it's the shade on the top left corner. It's very similar to this shade. So the next shade is this shimmery pink shade with flip of violet and maybe slight champagne gold as well. I could be wrong. So I picked three colors for this. You don't necessarily have to dig in palettes. This is something you can find if you have single multichrome shadows from any of the indie brands that sell multichrome. So you can find something very similar. So I found the shade Zuba in the Juvia's Place palette, which is has pink to gold reflex. Then I jumped into the Club Nebula palette and I picked the shade Celestial, which has purple flecks, and this last one is the shade Amaretto, again from the Kaleidos Escape Pod palette. And once again I tried layering the second shade, that is the one from the Kaleidos Club Nebula, over the Juvia's Place shade, and it gave a very similar shade. So the next shade is this blue green kind of a shade. It flips both blue and green, so I guess it is some kind of a turquoise. So for the first option I picked the shade Frozen from the BH Cosmetics bubblegum palette. It is a blue with a slight green flip. And then I picked the shade Firefly from the Kaleidos Club Nebula palette, and that leans more green. So what I did once again is layer the second shade over the first one to achieve somewhat of a similar shade. And like I said before, these kind of special shades you can very easily find in your collection if you have multichromes from other brands like Devina or Cleona or something like that. So for the final shade I picked two options, and I believe the first one is very similar. It's from the Oceanic palette by Ace Beauty, and it's the shade Fiji. I think this is very similar to the shade that they have in the Flower Punk palette. And the second one is from the Kaleidos Club Nebula palette. It's the shade 7 of 9. It's a lot darker, but I just watched it for fun. So this is my final set of shades that I felt that were closest to the shades of the Kaleidos Flower Punk palette. I want you guys to shop your stash and let me know if you could create a color story like this. Just in case you don't want to pick up the palette, or maybe you want to wait for a sale, this would be a fun way to talk yourself out of doing it. I might end up picking this palette up later sometime, maybe with another launch or during some kind of a sale, but for now I'm passing on this one. I hope you like this video. If you did, do give it a thumbs up and let me know which other palette I should try and look through my collection and dupe. Thank you for watching.